They were given scraps, pig feet, corn husks, wild weeds. Yet, from almost nothing, enslaved people built a food culture that still feeds America today. These weren't just meals, they were survival. Every dish carried pain, resilience, and a story that most history books leave out. In this video, we're uncovering 25 survival foods of slaves on plantations, the forgotten meals that kept people alive through one of the darkest chapters in history, and the hidden roots of dishes still on our tables today. Stick around, because some of these will shock you. 1. Parched corn, toasted dried kernels. When hunger hit hard in the fields, there wasn't always a pot or fire to cook a meal. That's where parched corn came in. Enslaved people would toast dried kernels until they browned and popped with flavor. It was portable, it was filling, and it could last for weeks without spoiling. Think of it as their original trail mix, except it wasn't for hiking trips, it was for survival. Parched corn gave enough energy to push through backbreaking work, and sometimes it was all a person had to eat for an entire day. Fast forward to today, and you'll see echoes of it in kettle corn at a fair, or the roasted corn nuts sold in gas stations. But for those living on plantations, this wasn't a snack, it was life or death. And here's the twist. This simple survival food didn't just keep people alive, it became the seed of Southern food traditions that we still taste today. But what happened when the corn ran out? The answer was another dish so plain, so bare bones, it shocked even visiting outsiders. 2. Boiled cornmeal mush. If parched corn was the pocket food of survival, then cornmeal mush was the hot meal that kept folks going at night. Just cornmeal, water, and salt, boiled until it thickened into a heavy porridge. No milk, no butter, none of the extras we throw in today. Just enough to quiet an empty stomach. This dish was so common, it showed up in slave narratives again and again. Sometimes it was ladled into wooden troughs where children would gather around with spoons, eating side by side like piglets at a pen. Brutal, humbling, but it kept them alive. Here's the part that sticks. Mush wasn't just dinner. Cold leftovers were sliced and fried the next day, turning into something closer to polenta cakes. That simple stretch, boiling once, frying twice, doubled the food supply and saved scraps that might have gone to waste. Fast forward to today, and you'll still see its shadow in Southern fried cornmeal cakes, or even Italian polenta fries on restaurant menus. But for the enslaved, mush was survival stripped bare, plain, heavy, and unforgettable. 3. Turnip greens stew. When scraps of meat were scarce, and they almost always were, enslaved families turned to the earth itself. Turnip greens, those bitter leaves most folks tossed aside, became the backbone of survival stews. Boiled soft, seasoned with nothing more than a pinch of salt, or maybe a scrap of pork fat if you were lucky, this wasn't comfort food. It was endurance food. But here's the thing. Greens carried more than just calories. They gave strength. They filled the belly with warmth when winter winds cut through thin clothes in bare cabins. A pot of turnip greens simmering on a fire wasn't just food. It was hope stretched into a meal. Over time, that bitter, earthy flavor became familiar, even cherished. Families passed down ways to soften the bite. Slow cooking, mixing in roots, adding in whatever scraps they could. And that tradition echoes loud today. Walk into a Southern kitchen and you'll still see pots of greens on the stove, collards, mustards, or turnips, seasoned up and served with cornbread. But for the enslaved, it started with survival, not taste. A stew made of leaves, stalks, and scraps most people wouldn't touch. 4th, cowpea stew. Long before black-eyed peas were a New Year's tradition, they were a survival food on the plantations. Enslaved Africans carried knowledge of cowpeas with them across the ocean. Hardy beans that grew well in the southern heat and poor soil. Cheap, filling, and packed with protein, They were a lifeline when meat was just a memory. Cowpea stew was simple. Boil the beans soft, add a little salt, maybe toss in a scrap of pork rind if you had it. Sometimes it's simmered with wild herbs or onions from the fields, but more often it was just beans and water, plain, heavy, and sustaining. But here's the powerful twist. Cowpeas weren't just survival food, they were a taste of home. For many enslaved people, this was one of the few foods that tied them back to Africa, where cowpeas had been cooked for generations in stews and porridges. Eating them wasn't just filling the belly, it was holding onto a piece of identity in a world trying to erase it. And today, that legacy is alive every time black-eyed peas are served with rice or simmered into hop and john. What started as a survival stew is now a symbol of luck, prosperity, and Southern tradition. But survival wasn't always planted or grown. Sometimes it was plucked straight from the dirt and boiled down into something barely edible. 5. Dandelion greens, boiled soft. When you think of dandelions today, you probably picture weeds in the yard, something to spray or pull out. But for enslaved families, those so-called weeds were a gift from the earth. Dandelion greens grew wild, needed no planting, and filled pots when nothing else was left. Boiled soft, the greens lost some of their bitterness, though not all. Sometimes they were flavored with a splash of vinegar, maybe a sliver of fat, but most days it was just greens and water. A thin broth, a chewy bite, and just enough to take the edge off hunger. Here's the hidden beauty. Dandelions carried nutrients, iron, vitamins, strength. Even if plantation owners didn't know or care, enslaved cooks understood that these weeds were more than filler. They were survival medicine, and this survival food didn't fade away. In parts of the South, dandelion greens were eaten well into the 20th century, and today, they've circled back as a trendy superfood in fancy restaurants and health stores. Imagine that. What was once desperation food now sells for $5 a bundle. But if bitter weeds could become a meal, imagine what happened when the rare sweetness of sugar trickled into enslaved hands. 6. Molasses water, sweet ration drink. Sugar was money on the plantations, and enslaved people rarely tasted it. But every so often, they'd be given a ration of molasses. Thick, dark, sticky. It wasn't candy, but it was sweet. And that sweetness meant everything. The simplest way to make it last? Stir a spoonful into a tin cup of water. That was molasses water, a poor man's energy drink. It gave quick calories, a burst of sweetness in a life where flavor was almost always bitter. For children, that cup was a rare treat. For adults, it was fuel, enough to push through another day in the fields. Sometimes it doubled as medicine too, mixed with herbs to soothe coughs or settle the stomach. What's wild is how much this echoes forward. Molasses water was survival, but it was also the seed of Southern desserts, barbecue sauces, and baked goods we love today. That sticky sweetness shaped the flavor of an entire region. But if molasses was rare gold, the next food was the opposite. Scraps so unwanted that plantation owners tossed them aside. And yet, enslaved cooks turned them into a meal that still stirs debate today. 7. Salt pork scraps, fried or boiled. Meat was a luxury enslaved people almost never saw, unless it was the parts nobody else wanted. That's where salt pork scraps came in. Plantation owners kept the hams, chops, and roasts, while the fat trimmings, rinds, and scraps went to the slave quarters. Fried in a pan, those scraps released grease that seasoned everything from beans to greens. Boiled, they became chewy bites in a pot of stew. And when there wasn't even meat left, just the fat, enslaved cooks saved every drop, stretching it to flavor cornmeal mush or bitter greens. Here's the hard truth. Salt pork was never meant to be a gift. It was cheap, preserved, and considered unfit for proper tables. But in the hands of enslaved people, it became a cornerstone of survival cooking. That salty, smoky flavor carried through entire meals, making scraps taste like feasts. And the legacy? You can still taste it today. Southern soul food, from collard greens simmered with ham hock to fried cabbage with bacon, traces back to those scraps. What was once cast off has become comfort. But meat scraps weren't the only thing enslaved cooks transformed. When gardens and fields thinned out, they turned to pumpkins and wild greens, simmering them into a survival stew that fed entire families. 8. Pumpkin and wild greens pottage. When food was running thin, enslaved cooks had to get creative with whatever the land gave up. Pumpkins, growing wild in patches, and bitter greens from the fields often ended up together in one pot. The result was a pottage, a simple stew that was more survival than celebration. Chunks of pumpkin gave sweetness and body, while the greens, tough, bitter, and stringy, filled out the pot. Sometimes the whole thing simmered with just water and salt. Other times, if luck struck, a sliver of pork fat or a stray onion added flavor. Nothing was wasted, nothing was fancy, but together it made enough to share. Here's the thing, this wasn't just food, it was survival alchemy, taking the bland, the bitter, and the unwanted, and turning them into something warm and filling. That kind of cooking taught resourcefulness, taught endurance, and the echo still lingers. You can see it today in southern pumpkin soups, fall stews, even the way greens get cooked down low and slow until they soften into comfort. What started as a poor man's pottage has become a backbone of seasonal cooking. But pumpkins held another secret too. Not just the flesh, but the seeds. Roasted, salted, and eaten by the handful, they were the snack that carried people through the leanest days. 9. Roasted pumpkin seeds. After the pumpkin flesh went into the pot, nothing was thrown away, not even the seeds. Enslaved families would wash them, dry them, and roast them over hot coals. With a little salt, if they had it, the seeds became a rare, crunchy snack. They weren't just tasty. Pumpkin seeds packed protein and fat, things that were scarce in a diet built mostly on grains and greens. For children especially, a handful of roasted seeds could mean the difference between going to bed starving and sleeping with at least a little comfort. Here's what makes it powerful. This was survival food born out of waste. What most plantation kitchens scooped out and tossed, enslaved cooks transformed into something useful, even enjoyable. That instinct to save, to stretch, to make something from nothing defined survival. And it's a tradition that stuck. Today, roasted pumpkin seeds show up in snack bags at gas stations, sprinkled over salads, even sold as superfoods in health stores. What was once desperation food now sells for dollars. But while seeds could be roasted into a treat, the root of the turnip offered another kind of survival. Roasted slowly until it was soft enough to stand in for bread or meat. 10. Turnip root roast. When bread was a luxury and meat was a dream, the humble turnip root became the next best thing. Dug straight from the dirt, scrubbed clean, and roasted in the ashes of a fire, it transformed from hard and bitter into something soft, earthy, and faintly sweet. Enslaved families treated roasted turnips like filler food, something to quiet hunger when cornmeal was gone. Sometimes it was eaten plain, sometimes mashed, and sometimes sliced thin and fried in pork fat if scraps were available. A poor man's potato, a survival man's bread. But here's the striking part. Roasting brought out a richness that made it almost feel like a treat. Imagine the smell of a smoky fire, the root blackened on the outside, steaming on the inside. It wasn't just food, it was warmth, something you could hold in your hands on a cold night. And this practice didn't fade. Roasted root vegetables became part of Southern kitchens, church suppers, and even holiday tables. What started as survival cooking carved a permanent place in American food traditions. But if the turnip root filled bellies, the next dish, a mash of corn and okra, carried flavors that connected enslaved Africans directly back to their homeland. 11. Okra and corn. Mashed okra wasn't native to America. It came over on slave ships, carried in memory and in seeds hidden in cloth. On the plantations, it grew well in the southern heat, and enslaved cooks mixed it with the one crop they always had, corn. The result was okra and corn mash, a dish that was simple, filling, and tied directly to Africa. The mash was usually just okra pods sliced thin, boiled down with ground corn or grits until it became a thick, sticky stew, sometimes slimy, sometimes gritty, but always enough to fill a stomach. When scraps of pork or onion were around, they'd get tossed in for flavor. But most nights, it was just the two staples, corn and okra. Here's the deeper story. Every bite of this dish was survival, yes, but it was also cultural memory. Okra stews and corn porridges were already part of African diets long before slavery. So when enslaved families mixed them together in America, they weren't just eating, they were preserving a piece of who they were. And you still see it today. Gumbo, succotash, and southern okra dishes all trace back to that mash. What started as survival in slave quarters became flavor woven into the South's identity. But when food didn't grow in fields or gardens, survival sometimes meant chasing it down in the woods, like the sweet fruit of the persimmon tree. 12. Foraged persimmons, mashed or eaten raw. Sweetness was rare on the plantation table, which made persimmons feel like treasure. Growing wild in southern woods and fields, these small orange fruits looked harmless enough, but bite into one before it was ripe, and your mouth puckered from the bitter astringency. Wait until the frost hit, though, and that same fruit turned soft, sweet, and golden. Enslaved families knew the trick. They foraged persimmons late in the season, eating them raw or mashing them into pulp. Sometimes the mash was dried into thin cakes, carried as a pocket food for long days in the fields. Other times, it was stirred into water to make a kind of sweet drink, like nature's answer to molasses. Persimmons weren't just about flavor. They were about luck, timing, and knowledge of the land. Knowing when to pick them, how to prepare them, and how to stretch them made the difference between a bitter mistake and a rare moment of sweetness in an otherwise harsh life. And persimmons never disappeared. You can still find them in southern backyards, turned into puddings, breads, and even country wine. What was once a foraged survival fruit became a hidden jewel of southern cooking. But fruit wasn't always plentiful. More often, survival meant making do with broken grains, the cast-off pieces of rice that planters considered worthless. 13. Broken rice porridge, Carolina middlings. On the Carolina plantations, rice was king, but enslaved families almost never saw the fine, polished grains that made planters rich. What they got instead were the middlings, broken bits of rice left over after milling. To the owners, it was waste. To the enslaved, it was survival. Those fragments were boiled into a thin porridge, sometimes salted, sometimes mixed with scraps of beans or greens, but most of the time just rice and water. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't filling for long, but it was fuel for another day of work. Here's the striking part. Enslaved Africans already had deep knowledge of rice cultivation and cooking from their homelands. They knew how to coax flavor and sustenance from even the broken grains. And in that, they preserved not just their bodies, but their culture. That broken rice porridge was a lifeline. And over time, the idea of stretching humble rice into soups, porridges, and stews became a cornerstone of Southern kitchens. Even today, dishes like rice, gruel, or congee-style porridges echo that same survival method. But when rice was gone, enslaved families turned to what the woods gave them, wild fruits that clung to vines and stained fingers purple. 14. Wild muscadine grapes. Deep in the southern woods, tangled vines offered a secret gift. Muscadine grapes, thick-skinned, bursting with juice. These wild grapes weren't the neat, seedless kind you see in stores today. They were messy, tart, and sometimes sweet enough to feel like a miracle. For enslaved families, muscadines were a rare taste of abundance. Children foraged for them, staining their hands and mouths purple, while adults mashed them into pulps or boiled them down for juice. If enough were gathered, The fruit could even be preserved into syrups, a way to stretch the sweetness into the lean months. Here's the deeper meaning. Muscadines weren't just food, they were freedom food. They grew outside the plantation's control, in woods and thickets, ripe for the taking if you knew where to look. Finding them was a small act of independence, a reminder that the land still gave gifts even in the harshest times. And muscadines never left southern life. Today, they're turned into jellies, wines, and juices, prized as a native fruit. What once kept hunger at bay now sits bottled on store shelves. But the next food was no gift of the land. It came from the slaughterhouse, a cut so unwanted most people wouldn't touch it, the tongue of a cow. 15. Boiled cow tongue. On the plantation, the best cuts of beef never reached the slave quarters. But when a cow was butchered, parts like the tongue, tough, fatty, and considered undesirable, sometimes did. Enslaved cooks wasted nothing, and boiled cow tongue became both survival and ingenuity. The preparation was plain. The tongue was scrubbed, boiled for hours until tender, and then sliced thin. Sometimes a pinch of salt or a splash of vinegar gave it flavor, but most of the time it was eaten just as it was, chewy, heavy, and filling. Here's the truth. Tongue wasn't just a scrap. It was a rare source of real protein and fat in a diet that leaned heavily on grains and greens. For families used to stretching vegetables and corn into meals, having actual meat, even from the tongue, felt like a victory. And what's fascinating is how that scrap transformed over time. Today, beef tongue is a delicacy in cuisines around the world, from tacos de lengua in Mexico to deli-style tongue sandwiches in New York. What the enslaved once ate out of necessity is now served on menus for a premium. But when meat like this was rare, survival meant turning back to the grind, literally, with cracked corn boiled into plain grits. 16. Cracked corn grits, plain. If there was one food that never disappeared from the slave diet, it was corn. Ground fine, it became mush. Left in bigger pieces, it became grits. Enslaved families boiled cracked corn in water until it swelled and softened into a thick, plain porridge. No butter, no cream, no cheese, just corn and water. This dish was filling, but it wasn't indulgence. It was survival fuel. Heavy enough to quiet the belly, simple enough to make in one pot, and cheap enough to always be on hand, day after day. Grits showed up at the table in some form, morning or night. Here's the part that resonates. Even though it was plain, grits became a foundation of Southern cooking. Over time, with seasoning, milk, or gravy, they turned from survival food into comfort food. But in the slave quarters, plain grits were often the first bite of the day, and sometimes the only one. It's a reminder of how staples endure. Today, grits are dressed up with shrimp in fancy restaurants or smothered with cheese at diners. But their root story is far grimmer. A bowl of cracked corn keeping bodies alive under impossible conditions. And while grits warmed the body, enslaved families also turned to the woods for warmth in another way, steeping the roots of sassafras trees into a survival tea. 17. Sassafras root tea. When water alone grew dull, enslaved families turned to the woods for flavor. The root of the sassafras tree, dug from the earth and boiled, made a tea unlike anything else, earthy, fragrant, with a hint of sweetness. Long before root beer was ever bottled, sassafras root tea was a survival drink. It wasn't just about taste. Sassafras was believed to have healing powers. A hot cup of the tea soothed coughs, eased fevers, and gave comfort when no real medicine was available. For people forced to work sunup to sundown with little rest, that mattered. Here's the striking part. Enslaved cooks weren't just boiling roots out of desperation. They carried herbal knowledge from Africa and learned new ones from Native Americans, blending traditions to survive. Sassafras became more than a drink. It was resilience in a cup, and this survival tea left a lasting mark. Centuries later, its flavor inspired root beer, a drink now loved worldwide. But its origin wasn't sweet soda in frosty mugs. It was enslaved families huddled by firelight, sipping warmth from a root pulled out of the ground. But not everything from the land was brewed or boiled. Some foods were preserved, like cucumbers and peppers, dropped into brine to last through lean months. 18. Pickled cucumbers and peppers, brine preserve. Fresh food never lasted long in the slave quarters, so preserving became a way to stretch the harvest. With just salt, water, and time, enslaved cooks turned cucumbers and peppers into sharp, tangy pickles that could last for weeks. The process was simple. Slice the vegetables, pack them into jars or crocks, and pour over brine. After sitting a few days, the crunch softened, but the flavor grew bold, sour, salty, sometimes even spicy if peppers were used. For families eating plain corn mush or bitter greens, a pickle on the side was a burst of flavor that made survival meals bearable. Pickling wasn't just about taste, though. It was about security. When gardens and fields stopped producing, those jars of preserved vegetables meant there was still something to fall back on. A sour bite in the dead of winter could mean the difference between another day of strength and the edge of hunger. And the legacy? Southern kitchens never let it go. Chow-chow, pepper relish, bread and butter pickles, all trace back to those first brined jars on the plantation. What started as necessity became tradition. But not every survival food came from the garden. Sometimes it meant cracking open the hardest gifts of the forest, like black walnuts, bitter and stubborn, but worth the effort. 19. Foraged black walnuts. If you've ever cracked open a black walnut, you know it's no easy task. The shells are thick, the stain seeps into your hands, and the nut meat hides deep inside. But for enslaved families, black walnuts were worth every strike of a rock or hammer. Gathered from the forest floor, the nuts were prized for their richness. Once cracked, the kernels offered protein, fat, and a flavor far stronger than regular walnuts. Sometimes they were eaten raw. Other times, chopped and stirred into porridges or used to stretch a simple dessert when molasses was on hand. Here's the deeper truth. Black walnuts weren't just food. They were survival treasure. Every nut cracked meant energy stored, a small victory against hunger. Families would save them for lean months or carry them into the fields for quick strength, and over time, their legacy spread. Black walnut cake, black walnut ice cream, even old-fashioned candies all stem from a food-enslaved people first foraged out of necessity. What the land gave as hardship, they turned into nourishment. But when nuts and fruit weren't around, survival meant scraping from the core of the garden itself, boiling down cabbage hearts and stems that others would have thrown away. 20. Stewed cabbage cores. On the plantation, the crisp outer leaves of cabbage might make it to the owner's table, but the tough, woody cores, those were tossed aside. In the slave quarters, though, cabbage cores weren't waste. They were boiled down, softened, and transformed into survival stew. The cores were chopped and simmered for hours until the fibers gave way. Sometimes they were flavored with a pinch of salt or, if fortune smiled, a scrap of pork fat. More often, it was just cabbage and water, thin, bland, but enough to put something warm in an empty belly. Here's what's powerful. Enslaved families had no room for waste. What others discarded, they found a way to eat. Those cabbage cores filled the pot and stretched meals a little further. And in a world where every calorie counted, even the scraps mattered. And this resourcefulness left a mark. Southern kitchens to this day have recipes that use the whole vegetable, stewed cabbage, braised stalks, even pickled stems. What began as desperation cooking became part of the region's food identity. But not every preservation was so plain. Sometimes survival came with spice, like green tomato chow-chow, a tangy relish that added bite to otherwise bland meals. 21. Green tomato chow-chow relish.